This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the SHARE website soon. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Caroline Bersak is the Assistant Director of Legal Services at the Family Center. The Family Center is a multidisciplinary nonprofit serving New Yorkers affected by illness, crisis, and loss. Its Legal Wellness Institute provides holistic legal services to individuals and families affected by severe illness or disability, including all types of cancer. Caroline represents clients on cases relating to public benefits and entitlements, housing law, family law, and lifetime planning, and also supervises the Legal Wellness Institute's attorneys, advocates, and volunteers. Caroline holds BAs from Brown University in Community Health and Public Policy and received her JD from NYU School of Law. Welcome, Caroline.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for joining. So I think many people are familiar with some types of Social Security benefits, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today, our Social Security's disability-related benefits. And when it comes to these specific types of Social Security benefits, they can be quite confusing and technical. So we'll try to demystify the rules and processes a little bit, focusing on certain issues that may be particularly relevant to people with metastatic cancer. So first, I am an attorney. I do need to provide a few disclaimers. First off, this presentation is just a broad overview. As I said, these are very complicated and technical rules. There are a lot of additional exceptions, rules, processes, and requirements that may not be explicitly listed or discussed during this presentation. Also, this does not constitute legal advice, and as Stephanie said, we can't give you specific advice on your own personal situation necessarily. Finally, it is always advisable that you consult with an attorney or other expert about your personal situation if there's anything that you think may be a little bit unusual or complex. And these rules apply to adults only. There are very different rules and processes involved for children who are applying for Social Security-based benefits. So these are the two programs we're going to be focusing on today. That's Social Security Disability Insurance and Supplemental Security Income. And just to keep things as confusing as possible, these are often referred to in a lot of different ways. So Social Security Disability Insurance is sometimes called SSD, SSDI, DIB, which stands for Disability Insurance Benefits, or Title II, because it is Title II of the Social Security Act that authorizes these benefits. And Supplemental Security Income is sometimes called SSI or Title 16. Both of these programs are administered by Social Security for people who meet their very specific definition of disabled, and they use that same definition for medical eligibility or disability eligibility. We'll discuss in much more detail what that definition is, but as a little spoiler, it basically all boils down to your ability to work. These programs are both only for people with long-term disabilities. Social Security defines that as meaning one that will last 12 months or more or be likely to result in your death. It does not cover any disability that is expected to last less than 12 months, no matter how severe that condition may be. The two programs do have very different financial and other eligibility requirements, which we'll go over. And depending on your specific situation, some people may be eligible to receive both Social Security Disability Insurance and Supplemental Security Income. So as an overview of Social Security Disability Insurance, which I'll generally call SSDI, it is a benefit that is provided to people who are insured through the program, and the way that you become insured is based on your work history. It gives people a monthly payment, and the amount of that specific payment will depend based on your own personal work history. If you are found to be disabled and eligible for these benefits, you may be able to get an additional monthly amount for certain dependent family members, including minor children, disabled adult children, or spouses. People who are eligible for SSDI will become eligible for Medicare health coverage after 24 months of entitlement for SSDI. One other really important thing to know in your sort of financial planning is that there is a 5-month waiting period in order to receive SSDI benefits. So you cannot get benefits starting the very day you are determined disabled. You have to wait 5 months from that, and only then will they start paying benefits. Some people, if you are eligible for SSI, meaning you have fairly low income and assets, you may be able to get SSI during that waiting period if you don't have other income. And another good thing to know is that you can be paid benefits retroactively for up to 1 year before the date you applied if you are found to have been disabled earlier than your application dates. So we'll go over some of the basic eligibility requirements for SSDI. First and most important is that you must be disabled, and again, that is disabled based on Social Security's very specific definition. You also must be insured for the program. It is an insurance-based program, and the way you become insured is based on your work history, which Social Security sometimes calls your earning record. So you have to have worked both long enough and recently enough to be insured for these benefits when you become disabled. Only work that you've done on the books with Social Security taxes paid will count towards your eligibility. And the way they quantify this is that you need a specific number of work credits, or they call them quarters of coverage, to be eligible. You can check your own eligibility by logging on to Social Security's website. It will usually tell you what your insured status is. And the specific requirements for the numbers of credits you need will vary a little bit based on your age. People who are younger will need fewer credits. For income eligibility for Social Security disability insurance, the general rule is that when you are applying, you cannot be earning more than $1,170 a month. The key words here are earning, and that amount will change annually. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but that is because if you are earning more than that from work, then you will likely not meet Social Security's definition of disabled. There are certain incentive programs and there are certain exceptions for people who return to work after they have already been determined to be disabled. There are also a few types of expenses and other things that may be deducted from your gross income. But there is no limit on unearned income for SSDI eligibility. So if you receive something like alimony, child support payments, a pension, something like that that is not linked to your work, that you are not currently earning, then that will not affect your ability to receive SSDI. There is also no resource or asset limit. So you can have as much money as possible in the bank, you can own different properties, you can own all sorts of things, and that will not affect your eligibility to receive SSDI. And as a last note, there are certain immigration requirements. So if you are not a U.S. citizen, you might want to look into whether you have an eligible immigration status. One other thing to note is that if you are not insured based on your own work history, depending on your age, your marital status, and a number of other personal factors, it may be possible for you to receive benefits based on somebody else's work history. Usually that's a spouse, an ex-spouse, or a parent, something like that. And that's generally only if that person is also currently receiving retirement or disability benefits. But it's a little thing to keep in mind if you don't qualify based on your own work history. So now we'll talk about Supplemental Security Income, which is SSI. This is a little different in that it is a monthly cash payment made to people who are aged, blind, or disabled, who also have very limited income and assets, and it's generally intended to help make sure they can pay for basic needs such as food, clothing, and shelter. Your work history does not matter for your eligibility. It doesn't, if you've never worked at all, you can still receive SSI. Unlike SSDI, which is based on your own personal earnings record, for SSI, there is a maximum monthly benefit amount that they can pay, which is set by law every year. This is called the federal benefit rate. For 2017, that maximum amount someone can receive while getting SSI is $735 a month. That may change in 2018 if Social Security decides to do a cost of living adjustment, or it may not. So $735 is the maximum amount that you can receive through SSI. The actual amount that you receive will depend on your own specific situation. So they will take into account any other income that you have, earned and unearned income. They take into account in-kind support. So that means if someone is helping to pay for some of your bills and expenses. And they also take into account your living arrangement. So people who live alone are usually eligible for a higher benefit rate than people who live with others. There's also a different federal benefit rate, maximum amount, if both spouses in a married couple are eligible for and receiving SSI. And in that situation, the couple would be entitled to only $1,103 as a maximum amount each month. Because $735 or $1,103 for two people is not a whole lot of money, some states have chosen to supplement this federal benefit amount with state funds. This is usually called a state supplement program, and there's a link in the presentation where you can look for some more information about which states provide this, how much they provide, and more information about state supplements. SSI also does not include additional benefits for any other family members. It is only paid for the disabled person or the disabled couple where both people are disabled. Unlike SSDI, which will give you eligibility for Medicare after 24 months, SSI will give you eligibility for Medicaid immediately, so there is no waiting period. And SSI benefits can only be paid out as of the month after you apply. Even if you were disabled much earlier than when you applied, you do not get any retroactive benefits for SSI. So here are some basic eligibility requirements for supplemental security income. First is that you must be either aged, which Social Security defines as 65 or older, or blind, according to their very specific definition, or disabled, again, according to their very specific definition. There are very complex income rules for SSI. I've tried to boil them down a little bit here, but there's a lot more to them. So basically, a claimant, someone who is applying for SSI, cannot generally have earned income, again, income they're receiving from their work, that is above $1,170 a month. And again, that is because that is part of Social Security's definition of disability. Again, that $1,170 amount will change every year. And again, there also are special rules and other incentives for people who do return to work after being declared disabled, and other types of expenses that may be able to be deducted from earnings. There is also a total countable income that you can have, and that means they take into account both your earned and your unearned income for SSI eligibility. And so the combination of both of those, the amount that they count must be below the relevant federal benefit rate, which is $735 for one person. But one thing to keep in mind is that they don't actually necessarily count 100% of all your income. So for example, they do some heavy discounts for any earned income. There are certain types of income that they don't count at all, and the rules are very complicated for that. But another thing that is important is if you are married and living with your spouse, they will deem your spouse's income to you, meaning your spouse's income will count as yours. There is a little bit of math that is done to take into account your spouse's needs and the needs of children who are in the home. And for SSI, again, there's that $735 maximum monthly amount for an individual, but the amount you actually receive each month will be adjusted every month based on your income. So if your income fluctuates month to month, so will your SSI amount. There is also a resource or an asset limit for SSI. An individual can only have $2,000 or less than $2,000, in countable assets to be eligible, and a married couple will be allowed to have up to $3,000 in countable assets. Again, not necessarily everything is countable. There are certain types of things that you own that will not count towards this limit, but things that do count are things like cash in the bank, more than one vehicle, other things like that. Another thing to keep in mind is that assets that are in your spouse's name may also be deemed to be yours. And there are penalties for transferring or giving away assets to make yourself eligible for SSI, so you want to be really careful about that. Again, these asset and resource limits only apply to SSI eligibility. They do not apply for SSDI eligibility. And finally, there are fairly complex immigration and citizenship requirements and some additional eligibility requirements for people who are not citizens. So there's a link in the slide to learn a little bit more about that. So for both of these programs, we know that you have to be disabled according to Social Security's specific definition. So let's talk about what Social Security thinks disability means. According to them, a disability is an inability to engage in any substantial gainful activity by reason of any medically determinable physical or mental impairment which can be expected to result in death or which has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. And that comes from the Social Security Act. So that is clearly very complicated, uses a whole lot of words, and is very different from the way we usually use the word disabled or disability in normal conversation. So in order to try to make sense of this and to make it a useful thing that you can apply to a specific person, Social Security uses a 5-step evaluation process, which they call the sequential evaluation, to actually apply this definition and evaluate if a specific person is disabled according to their rules. So this is a kind of graphic representation of those 5 steps. We'll go over each one individually, but as you can see, kind of looking at this list, there are only 2 steps at which you can actually, quote unquote, win or be found disabled, but there are 4 of the 5 steps where you can lose or be found to not be disabled. So we'll start with step 1, which is, are you currently engaging in substantial gainful activity? Which again is a term that comes right out of that definition that we just went over. What that really means is, are you currently working and earning more than a specific dollar amount per month? That specific dollar amount is called the SGA level, and it is set by law every single year. So for 2017, the SGA level is $1,170 per month. So if you are working and your monthly earnings average more than $1,170, you will not be found disabled regardless of what your medical condition is or how severe it is. There is, of course, one little asterisk down there which says, except in limited circumstances. As I said before, there are certain types of expenses and deductions that may be taken from your gross income in certain situations. If you are not working at all, or you are working but your earnings are less than $1,170 per month in 2017, then you move on to step 2. Step 2 asks, do you have a severe medical impairment that is expected to last at least 12 months or result in your death? So this is a lot of things all rolled into one step. So the first thing is, you must have one or more medical or mental health condition that is diagnosed by an appropriate medical professional. And just as a note, I'll use the word medical condition or medical impairment or impairment. That means both physical or mental condition. Both your physical and mental health conditions and impairments must be taken into account by Social Security. So severe is also a key word here, and it has a specific definition. And severe means that your impairment or combination of impairments must interfere with your ability to do basic work-related activities. So that's things like walking, sitting, standing, lifting, following instructions, making decisions, completing tasks, interacting with others, those kinds of just basic things that you need to do really any kind of job. And one key thing to remember is that if you have more than one diagnosed medical condition, Social Security has to consider the combined effect of all of your conditions when determining whether your impairments are severe. The next requirement is that your condition or combination of conditions must be expected to remain at that severe level for at least 12 months or have already been at that level for 12 months or they must be expected to result in your death. And that is, again, because Social Security does not provide benefits for any short-term disabilities. One other thing to keep in mind is that Social Security has to consider both your actual medical conditions, diagnoses, illnesses, injuries themselves, and they also have to take into account the treatment requirements and any side effects of any treatments in determining how severe your impairments are. So if your condition doesn't satisfy any one of these sort of 3 requirements that are rolled up into step 2, then you will not be found disabled and the evaluation stops here. If you satisfy all 3 of these requirements, then you move on to step 3. And step 3 is where it really gets into the nitty-gritty of medical requirements. So step 3 asks, does your medical condition match the criteria for a condition in Social Security's listing of impairments? So what does that mean? Well, Social Security regulations include a very, very long list of many different types of medical conditions. It is called the listing of impairments, or usually just called the listings. For each condition that's included in the listings, Social Security has specified medical criteria, which could be things like lab results, symptoms, anatomical findings, hospitalization or treatment requirements. It varies based on what the illness or condition is. But these criteria are specifically chosen because if you meet them, if you match them, then it means that your condition is so severe that it would be very likely that you would not be able to work. So it's kind of a shortcut for them. So if your medical records establish that your personal treatment or medical history meets any of the specified, all of the specified criteria for any condition in the listings, then this is called meeting a listing in Social Security lingo. You can also equal a listing, which means that you don't exactly satisfy every single listed criteria for a condition, but it's pretty close, and what you have is of equal medical significance. And to make that finding, Social Security will require opinion of a medical expert. The listings are available at that link that you can look up. They are organized generally by body system, except cancer is treated a little bit differently, and they have all of the cancers listed under one section. So if, based on your medical records, it looks like you do meet all of the criteria required for a condition that is listed, then Social Security will say that you are medically eligible for SSI or SSDI benefits. Again, and that is only if you have already made it through step 1 and step 2 of this evaluation. If your medical records do not show that you meet all of the requirements for a listing, then you move on to step 4. But before we do that, we're going to go over, I have here the listings for breast cancer. So this is what they look like. This is what a listing looks like. So it has at the top the specific condition, which here is breast cancer. And then for this specific illness, there are actually 5 different ways, A through E, that you can meet the listing. So we're not going to read through every specific one, but if your records can show that you meet what is said in A, B, C, D, or E, then you have met the listing and you meet the medical eligibility for disability. And I have also right here the listing for ovarian cancer, which is set up just a tiny bit differently because in the listings they group all cancers of the female genital tract together. But it is kind of similar requirements. Again, they're looking at metastases to lymph nodes or beyond, or recurrent cancers, those kinds of things. So one thing to note is that for either breast or ovarian cancer, if the cancer has metastasized to any other organ, then that would automatically show that it meets the listing. And what you want to make sure is that you have pathology or surgical reports that confirm that the cancer has spread. And that would establish the medical eligibility. So if you can't establish that you meet those very specific criteria, then you would move on to step 4. And step 4 is where your ability to do work really comes back into play. So step 4 asks, do you have the physical and or mental capacity to do any of your past relevant work? And again, all of those things have their own definition. So before they can actually make that determination, Social Security has to take a step back and they have to consider all of your impairments, all of your conditions, and all of the way that these limit your physical or mental functioning. And then once they know all the things you can't do, they have to kind of look at the reverse and see what you still can do despite your limitations. And this is called your residual functional capacity, or your RFC. So they have to determine both a physical RFC and a mental RFC. And one thing to keep in mind is that even if you don't have a diagnosed mental health condition, Social Security still needs to consider your mental residual functional capacity, because certain physical impairments may also affect your mental functioning. For example, if you have severe pain, if you have severe fatigue or difficulty sleeping, these things may affect your ability to concentrate, those types of things. They always have to take into account both physical and mental capacity. Your physical RFC is often expressed by Social Security as your ability to do work at a specific exertional level. So they may say that you are able to do sedentary work, light work, medium work, heavy work. And each of those has a specific definition based on the amount of standing, walking, how much weight you're expected to lift or carry based on the type of work. After they have determined your RFC, Social Security will then take a look back at the physical and mental demands of all of your past relevant work. And again, that has a specific definition, which is basically any job you've done at which you earned more than the relevant SGA level for the year in which you were doing that job. And they only go back 15 years from the date that they are evaluating your disability. So if you've had a very long work history, they're not going back all the way to the beginning. They just consider the past 15 years. They'll then compare the two. So they compare your RFC to what was required in your past jobs. And if, given your residual functional capacity, you could theoretically still return to any of your old jobs in the past 15 years, then you're not disabled. It does not matter whether that company has gone out of business, whether that particular position or type of job still exists, only that in some theoretical world you would be physically or mentally able to do that job. So if your impairment would prevent you from doing any of your past jobs from the previous 15 years, then you move on to step 5. And if it doesn't, then the evaluation would end here and you would not be considered disabled. So moving on to step 5, which asks, do you have the physical or mental capacity to do any other kind of work on a full-time basis? And this is where a lot of people really run into trouble because that's a really, really high standard to meet for disability. So at this step, they do take reality into consideration a little bit more. Social Security will consider, in addition to your residual functional capacity and your physical and mental limitations, they'll also consider your age, your education, your past work experience, and any skills you may have gained to determine whether there are other types of jobs that you could do on a full-time basis. As a shortcut, they refer to many publications from the Department of Labor about different types of jobs and occupations and statistics and how many exist. There is a set shortcut, which is called the grid rules, which is a set of rules found in Social Security's regulations. And this only applies to people who only have physical or exertional impairments. So impairments that would prevent you or limit your ability to sit, stand, walk, lift, carry, those kind of basic physical functions. And what those are just a set of charts organized by age and skill set and education level and those things, and you follow across, find all the cells that apply to you, and at the end it will suggest a determination of disabled or not disabled. So if applying all these different rules and evaluations, Social Security can come up with any job that you would still be able to do full-time given your physical and mental impairments, then you are not disabled and you can't receive SSDI or SSI. And again, that's a really high bar. As an example that is used frequently, Social Security will refer to the job of being a ticket taker at a movie theater. So what does that involve? It involves you can sit, you can stand, all you have to do is look at a ticket or maybe rip it. You don't really have to make any hard decisions or have any specific type of education or background to do that. You don't have to interact with people all that much. And so even though you're sick or you've got some other physical or mental condition, if you could do that basic type of job, then they'll say you're not disabled. But if Social Security determines that there aren't any other jobs that you could do because of your impairments on a full-time basis, then you are considered disabled and you'll be medically eligible to receive SSDI or SSI benefits. So that is the 5-step evaluation that they use to apply their very convoluted definition of disability. So let's talk a little bit about what the application process looks like and how it works. First, there are a few ways to start the application process for SSDI and SSI. You can start the process online. It will involve filling out a number of forms and giving a lot of information about yourself. Anyone applying for SSDI and most people applying for SSI can now apply online. You can call that 1-800 number to schedule either an in-person interview at your local Social Security office, or if you are homebound, you can schedule a phone-based interview, or you can just go ahead and walk into your local Social Security office. But depending on where you live, that may involve a very long wait. So when you apply, often Social Security will take applications for both SSI and SSDI together. You may not be eligible for both. That's usually fine, but in some situations it might make sense for you to only apply for SSDI, and so you might want to just kind of think about that or speak to someone who understands these specific rules a little bit better before you file that application. Before they even get to your medical eligibility, you need to establish your identity, that you are who you say you are. So that's usually, bringing in photo ID, a birth certificate, those types of things, your citizenship and immigration status, and any other eligibility requirements. So that means for SSI, you have to provide information and documentation about your current income, your living situation, and other things like that to determine whether you meet the financial eligibility rules for SSI. And of course, you'll have to also provide information about your assets and resources for SSI only. Social Security will then interview you, and you'll fill out a whole bunch of forms about your medical conditions, about your limitations, about your treatment, your medical providers, your education, your past jobs, and all sorts of things like that. Social Security will have you sign releases so that they can request medical records from your treating medical providers. And you also have the ability to submit and collect your own medical evidence, medical records, doctor's notes, statements from family and friends, things like that. Social Security is able to consider things beyond just strict medical records. They can consider, again, statements from people who know you about how your disability affects your functioning, things like that. There's a link with some checklist of very specific information you'll need to have on hand when you apply, so that if you're starting to think about this process, you can make sure you've got it all gathered together before you go ahead and start. While Social Security is considering and evaluating your case, which can take 3 to 6 months, sometimes more, sometimes less, they may require that you go for what's called a consultative examination, and that is when you are referred to a doctor or other medical provider who is contracted by Social Security to evaluate people who are applying for benefits. They sometimes do this if they feel like they didn't get enough information from your treating medical providers. And then the Disability Determination Service, which is a slightly separate entity from Social Security in each state, they will review all of the records and documents that come in, everything that they have requested and received, and everything that you provided to them or that you said in your interview or filled out in your forms, and they will use all of that to apply that 5-step sequential evaluation we just went through. And you'll be notified of the decision in the mail. Again, this process can take 3 to 6 months because they have to request the records, wait to see if they get anything, and then actually go through every single page, theoretically, of what is provided for you. That time period can be problematic for people who are very sick and who don't have other income. And in some cases, that might be really more complicated than is necessary. So Social Security has created what's called the Compassionate Allowance Program, sometimes called CALS. And what this is just a special kind of process that allows Social Security to quickly identify specified medical conditions that they think by definition will meet that very complicated disability standard. And it allows them to process these cases more quickly. So it can help reduce that sort of 3 or 6 month waiting time that it often takes for them to go through your case. Sometimes an application can be approved in days if they have all the information they need. They still do need to receive, medical evidence that confirms your condition and disabilities. And it's not really a separate set of rules or processes. You still have to meet all the other eligibility requirements for SSDI or SSI, and the 5-month waiting period will still apply from that date that you were initially determined to be disabled, but it just allows them to speed up that evaluation process and kind of put you ahead maybe of some other people who may be in their pile. So a list of conditions that are eligible as compassionate allowances are available at that link. And I've pulled 2 here. So this is the compassionate allowance listing for breast cancer. And basically in that initial list, it is just breast cancer with distant metastases or that is inoperable or unresectable. So what does that mean? It means that if you have evidence that your breast cancer has metastasized anywhere beyond the lymph nodes, then you qualify for this sort of expedited compassionate allowance review process. And hopefully your case can be decided, in a matter of days as opposed to a matter of months. So this slide includes some of the definitions of what they mean by inoperable or unresectable and some of the documentation that they usually want to see that supports that your condition meets those requirements. And the compassionate allowance listing for ovarian cancer is very, very similar. It's just ovarian cancer that is with distant metastases or that is inoperable or unresectable, and the same definitions and documentation requirements apply. And again, it's a little bit confusing, but just this is not a separate rule. This does not replace that first set of listings that you talk about at step 3. This is just when you go in to apply for benefits and you say, I have metastatic breast cancer, that should basically set off an alarm bell in the Social Security representative's head that you qualify for this very minimal and expedited type of review. So here are some tips that you can take that might help to make sure your application process goes smoothly, goes a little bit more quickly, and that it is successful. So one thing to keep in mind is that you should apply as early as possible when you think that you might be disabled, especially if you're applying for SSI, because remember, you can't get any benefits before your date of application for SSI. But you do want to be careful to make sure you do actually qualify when you apply. If you're still, working and your earnings are at or pretty close to that SGA level, you might not actually meet the definition of disability. Another really key thing is to collect and submit your own evidence, so that they really like to see actual medical records, so you can request those from your doctors, oncologists, hospitals where you have received chemotherapy or radiation or had any surgical pathology tests done. It can also be really helpful to get a letter from your doctor that kind of spells out your diagnosis, your treatment plan, your prognosis, and what you've already gone through. For anyone who's ever actually looked at their own medical records, you know that sometimes it's hard to get a real clear story of what's actually going on from the records, so it can be helpful to have a letter from your doctor that really spells it out for them. And again, those if you think that you meet one of those compassionate allowance conditions, to try to make sure you bring in those specific reports, operative or pathology reports that they've discussed in there. And this is helpful for two reasons. Number one, it can really expedite. If you show up with proof that you meet one of those compassionate allowance or one of those other listings, they might be able to review your case, in a matter of days, because they don't have to send out requests for records, wait for them to come in, and then review them from all of your doctors and hospitals. The other reason it's helpful is because even if you don't meet one of those compassionate allowance listings, again, Social Security is supposed to request records from all of your treating sources and then review them. In reality, I do think they do that, but hospitals and doctors' offices and other clinics don't always respond to those requests. Or if they do respond, sometimes they send a very strange set of records that has nothing to do with your current treatment or your current condition. And so if you don't bring in anything yourself, you're kind of leaving it up to fate and to Social Security and a whole bunch of strangers to try to make sure that they get the right information. If you do bring it in yourself, then you make sure that they know what you want them to know and that they know the information that is important. When you are filling out all the various forms that they will have you fill out when you apply, it's important to list every single medical and mental health condition that you have, even if it seems like that condition isn't actually a big deal. You have cancer, so why do they care about the fact that you maybe also have diabetes or depression or hypertension or anything like that? But it does matter, because if you don't meet one of those very obvious listing rules, then they are, again, supposed to take into account all of your conditions and limitations and diagnoses when they're making this evaluation. It's also very important that you list every single doctor or hospital or clinic or other medical provider that you have been to, even if you only saw them once, when you are filling out these forms, so that Social Security can try to get as full a record as possible for you. It's a good idea to kind of have your calendar or journal with you, or to take a look at it beforehand so you really remember dates when things happened, when you were diagnosed, when you started treatment, when you had surgery, when you were hospitalized, when you stopped working or started working less. All of those things are going to be relevant. And the last thing is you might want to speak to family and friends about whether they've noticed any new limitations or problems that may be related to your medical conditions. Social Security will ask you to kind of explain or fill out forms about what are your limitations that are caused by your medical conditions. Some things you will know very well yourself. Other things you may not even realize are happening, but other people around you have noticed. So it's a really good idea to kind of get a third party's view on how things may have changed for you since your condition started. So the appeals process we'll go through very, very briefly. If you apply, you provide information, and you get a determination that you are not disabled or not eligible in the mail, it's really important that you read that notice completely. There is a 60-day deadline from the date of that notice to appeal a decision that you don't agree with. That deadline can sometimes be extended if you've got good cause for not making that request on time, but it can be very difficult to meet that standard. So you want to make sure you're acting as quickly as possible. The actual process for appealing is different state by state. Some states have an initial reconsideration process in which a new person who didn't look at your records the first time will just kind of look again and see if they agree. Some states skip right to the administrative law judge hearing level, in which you will actually have an in-person hearing or a video hearing with a Social Security judge. And in many places, there is a very long wait for those benefits. So briefly, if you do have a successful application and you are found to be eligible for SSI or SSDI, there are some things you need to keep track of and need to keep in touch with Social Security about. So things like reporting changes. When you are approved, they will give you a notice that lists these requirements, but just a thing to keep in mind. You have to report changes in your household or your personal income, changes in your household composition, the people moving in and out, you moving, if your living arrangement changes, if your marital status changes. Very important that you report changes of your work activity. So if you go back to work, if you increase your hours or you increase your earnings for work, you have to report that. And if you have changes in your resources or assets for people who are on SSI only, you have to report that as well. A thing to keep in mind, again, for people who are receiving SSI is just want to keep track of your countable assets. Keep track of what's in your bank account especially, but also other types of assets to make sure you're not getting close to or going over that $2,000 limit or $3,000 if you're part of a couple. And then a last thing to keep in mind is that once you are found eligible for disability, it's not necessarily a permanent determination because people's health changes. And so every few years, most people receiving SSI or SSDI will be subject to what's called a continuing disability review, where Social Security will gather new medical information, new information about work to determine whether you still meet that definition of disability or whether your condition has improved to the point where you're not disabled based on their definition anymore. And how often that occurs or the length of time before they do that first one will depend on your specific condition and the likelihood of your improvement. I believe that for metastatic cancer, if you've been found eligible based on that, it's usually a 3-year period before they'll do that first review based to see if your medical condition has improved, but there may be other specific lengths of time they use for other reasons. So quick note about working while you are receiving SSI or SSDI. It is not impossible. You can sometimes work while you are receiving these if you are physically or mentally able to do so. Social Security wants people to go back to work, and they have a lot of rules and programs that incentivize this. But these rules are incredibly complex, and if you do something a little bit wrong or you go over an amount financially, it can jeopardize your benefits. So it's just really important that you really understand these rules. It's really ideal that you do some research or speak to someone who understands this well before you make any decisions about going back to work or increasing your work level. There are different rules and incentive programs based on whether you're receiving SSI or SSDI. And there is a link to what Social Security calls their Red Book, which is a book specifically about the employment rules and supports for people who are disabled. And that has some really clear explanations about some of these rules. And again, one other thing that I should say is that Social Security, their regulations, the laws, these processes, they are incredibly complex and sometimes very confusing. But Social Security's website has tons and tons of really, really excellent resources where they really break this down step by step and explain different rules or requirements. So it's, if you're looking for some specific information, that's a very good place to start. So I know there are some questions, and I'm happy to start taking some of those.
All right, great. Yeah, so for the Q&A, just please keep in mind that not all questions submitted will be able to be answered. If you submitted a question and you do not hear the answer, please feel free to call the SHARE helpline, and a trained volunteer will be able to help. So for the first question, I wanted to get sort of a clarification on the sequential process. Could we look at that slide again?
Sure. Let me go back and find it.
Sequential evaluation.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So for metastatic cancers, it seems like that fits the definition, their definition of disability. So what is the main concern for them to sort of pass this sequential evaluation?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So for people with metastatic cancer that you've got, good medical evidence that it has, metastasized beyond the regional lymph nodes, it's really going to be step one that is your main concern, and that is your current, your current work activity, whether you're currently earning more than that SGA level. And that's because if you do have metastatic cancer, they almost always, assume that it's a severe condition, that it will last 12 months or result in your death. Again, it will meet that step 3 listing, and so the evaluation would stop there. So the really important thing is making sure you have good medical evidence of the metastatic condition, and that your current work activity isn't going to stop you at step 1 from being found disabled.
Okay, so folks would want to, it would be beneficial, you say it would be beneficial for folks to try to obtain all their medical records prepared for the application?
Yes, yeah, that's a really good idea. Again, Social Security doesn't always do a great job of actually collecting what they should collect for you. I would say don't wait to file your application until you have all your records, because it may take you a while to get all those as well. But it's a good idea to, when you go to your doctors, ask if they can provide you with records, ask if they can get you a letter, bring whatever you have on hand with you when you go to apply, and then after you've applied, while they're working on their evaluation, you can continue to provide them additional records as they come in.
Okay, so for the income requirements while you're applying, you want to make sure that if you're currently employed, you're not making more than $1,170. Is that before or after taxes?
Yeah, that is gross income, so before taxes and other deductions. There are, like I said, there are a few things that sometimes can be deducted from this. One key thing that Social Security rules allow is that you can deduct what are called impairment-related work expenses, and those are things that you pay for out of pocket because of your condition that allow you to keep working even though you have some sort of severe medical condition. So examples of that are huge and wide-ranging. It can include, if you have to pay for a car service to take you to work because you can't drive or you can't take public transportation due to your condition, that might count. If you have out-of-pocket expenses for pain relievers or other medicines that allow you to work, that might count. It is fairly wide-ranging on what they will allow to count, but you want to make sure you've kind of really thought about it and spoken with someone who understands these requirements before you apply if your income is above $1,170.
Okay, yeah, we have, actually there's many questions about sort of the income rules, which I guess speaks to how complex this is and probably how may need to ask for help. So I want to ask those questions, but first I want to ask if you have any advice about where folks can get help to determine their financial eligibility. Do you know anything about that?
So there are first of all, a lot of websites, including Social Security's own website, that really breaks these rules down sort of step by step. That's a good place to look. There are also a lot of organizations in most states that do this type of work and may be able to provide more personalized advice or information even before you go ahead and apply. So legal aid societies in many states, legal service providers, many of those types of legal service organizations are familiar with these rules and can speak to a person about their own personal financial situation and whether they might be eligible for these benefits.
Okay.
I can say actually there's a website that is called lawhelp.org. That's a national website, I believe. And when you go there, you can pick your state, you can pick your legal issue, and so there is a drop-down list that would include Social Security, SSDI, SSI benefits, and you put in your zip code, where you live, what you're looking for help on, and it can come up with a list of legal providers that may be able to offer assistance or advice on that topic. So if you're looking to speak to an actual human being about how this might work for you, that may be a good place to look.
Okay. So just a few questions about the financial eligibility. Somebody was asking about if you have joint income with a spouse or a small family business. I guess let me separate those two. If you have joint income with a spouse, do they take into account the entire income, or do they take into account half the income, or how does that work? Do you know?
So that's a really good question. I mean, Social Security will consider your spouse's income even if it's not joint with yours. Even if your spouse has a whole, separate job, they are going to consider it. I have not seen any specific rules that relate to joint income, but they will definitely. So I'm not 100% sure on how they would consider it. They may, deduct certain allowances like they do from spouse's income in general, which is they usually deduct a certain amount for that spouse's support, for the support of any minor children in the home, those kinds of things. That's possible. I am not 100% sure, but they would definitely take into account more than just half of that income.
Okay. And what if the spouse is separated or not living in the home, or does it have to be a legal separation, or how would that work?
So I believe for most rules, if you are living separately from your spouse, they do not usually deem their income to you. Assets may get a little bit trickier, especially if you, own things in both of your names, those kind of situations. So it might be that could be a little bit more complicated. But I believe if you are not living in the same household, they don't usually count your spouse's income against you.
Okay. How about if you have ownership of a small family business?
Right.
How would they calculate, or any kind of small business, or how would they take that kind of income or assets into account?
Yeah, so Social Security has very specific rules about how they calculate self-employment income, which I think that would probably count as self-employment income. They, will often, they do deduct, business operating expenses, material, equipment and materials expenses, those kinds of things generally. But if you look on their website, and I can probably send out a link about this specifically if it's useful later, I believe there is a whole explanation about how they calculate that income, the accountable income for someone who is self-employed.
Okay. Let's see. There's still a couple of more questions. Oh, yeah. Somebody was wondering, so for the spouse's income being taken into account, that's for both SSDI and for SSI, or is it?
Right. Yes, for both.
Okay.
Well, it is for both, but if it doesn't, let me correct that. It's for SSI, really, because for SSDI, they don't really care what your other income is. They're only looking at your own earned income to determine if you meet that eligibility, that definition of disability. So if your spouse they won't count your spouse's earnings for you for SSDI. Excuse me.
Okay, and one more question on that is, what about any other kind of disability support, would that count as income if you?
Mm-hmm. Right. So yes. So a lot of people have some sort of long or short-term disability benefits from their employer or a policy they've paid for themselves. It's a slightly different answer based on whether you're receiving SSI or SSDI. If you are receiving SSI, yep, that will count as unearned income, and depending how much it is, it may make you either ineligible or they will reduce the amount of SSI that you are eligible to receive each month based on how much you're receiving from the disability insurance policy. If you are receiving SSD or SSDI, then the fact that you are receiving other disability insurance benefits will not change your eligibility or the amount that you receive in SSDI, but many disability insurance policies require that you apply for Social Security benefits, and if you start receiving them, then the private disability policy you have may reduce the amount that they will pay you if you start receiving Social Security benefits.
Okay. So I think we've run out of time, so we'll have to close on that. Thank you so much, Caroline Bersak of the Legal Wellness Institute, for this very informative program, and thank you all for participating and submitting your questions. This recording will be available on our website, and we will also email it out to all who have registered. And if you could please take a moment to fill out our survey that will pop up at the end. It might take a minute for it to load, but after you close out, it should pop out, and you can fill out that survey. Yeah, and thank you all.